All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the August 8th, 2022 Grants Pass City Council Workshop. Have to tell them to raise their hand when they're all ready to stop talking, huh? We're going to get started with the Allenwood property update.
All right, good morning. Amber Neek is our housing specialist, as you know, and she's here, but I'm going to go ahead and walk us through some of this. We're just going to tag team on this first item today. I'll kind of just bring council up to speed. You've recently talked about this property, so I was actually planning to move fairly quickly through the slides until we get to the kind of the last couple where we're talking about really your call to action, so you can have more time and then to talk about that. But the property, just to remind the council of the subject and summary here, this is we provided you a couple of months ago with a profile of the Allenwood property off of Williams Highway. It's been owned by the city since 2005. And there's 3 different parcels there, and the discussion that has been happening is what is the preference with this property related to affordable housing as compared to parks, which is what it was originally purchased for, and the general direction so far has been moving the property from its current state, which is vacant, undeveloped, into some kind of affordable housing. So it relates to your council goals, really 2 main ones: facilitate sustainable manageable growth and provide cooperative shared leadership. So just a reminder, this is kind of just south of the Allendale Elementary School. We're on the west side of Williams Highway there. The property is zoned R18 today, as is the majority of all the neighborhood. We did acquire the property, as I mentioned, in 2005 from Actuarial Pension Retirement Services for a little over $1 million. And it was added into the Parks Master Plan as Parks Reserve property, which is what it is today. And as we have talked about in the past, since it's Parks Reserve, that does mean that if you're not going to use it as parkland, the value that we originally purchased needs to be put back towards parks. In February of this year, the Housing Advisory Committee did talk about the property. They made a recommendation to the council to rezone the 3 lots that the city owns there to R3, pending a traffic impact analysis, and then considering acquiring the open space near the Allen Creek there, as well as to complete a wetland delineation. The traffic impact study, as we've talked about at prior council workshops, would be involved. That would obviously depend on the density. And then in April of this year, you expressed support for proceeding with a request for proposal to develop it as some kind of mixed density housing. But you asked for a little bit more information on the property to the south, which is Greg Jacoby is the owner of that and has communicated with the city in the past about possibly developing that, subdividing that. And so we did have a couple of conversations since your last workshop with Greg. So we reached out to him. He still has interest in developing the property, but they really are not at a point of ready to commit to any kind of development plan per se. So especially since he had already done a wetlands delineation on that property to the south that Greg owns, and the city has not done a wetland delineation on our piece, it made sense to maybe proceed at least right now with doing the wetland delineation on the city's property. Along with the traffic impact analysis, we could potentially use, since he has expressed some interest in proceeding, just not ready to commit right now, use the conceptual subdivision plan that he has laid out and sort of just add that in to a TIA, but we can talk more about that. So this just shows you the property as it is today. The area here, there is Allen Creek runs along the west boundary of the property, and so there is the associated wetlands there that comes over. Since we haven't had it delineated by a wetland scientist to date, what we show here is, you know, just the best guess essentially based off of soil types and vegetation and things like that, using aerial photos and sort of what looks like it would be wetlands. So this area that's shown is conceptual. So before any development would take place, there would need to be a delineation, which would mean hiring an ecologist or another wetland specialist to come onto the property and actually pull some soil samples and get some identification of the species and things like that are out there. It is recommended on these to not, you know, you're going to get the best reading to do it more, you know, in the winter or spring rather than right now. Typically is what they're going to recommend to us to do so that we get a more accurate reading on that, on where the wetlands is. So one of the questions that the council had last time was, well, what level of density do we think that we could get there? You expressed some interest in a mixed income housing, but also, you know, what would that look like? So this is definitely a crystal ball question right now because of where we're at with the middle housing code. And under the new middle housing rules, you know, you can do up to 4 units on any lot. So regardless of what the zoning is, so whether we keep it the current R18 zoning or we were to rezone it to R2 zoning, you know, a future developer could, in either one of those zones, come in with single family, duplex, triplex. You know, it's only if you hit that R3 or R4 do you get the required minimum density. So in terms of, you know, estimating, we did our best, and Amber worked with some of our planners and sort of, you know, did some back of the napkin kind of guesstimates here. We did take out what is shown to be the wetlands today, which again could be smaller, most likely wouldn't be larger, but we took what's there. And then we also took out what would be anticipated for streets, utility easements, you know, potential irrigation easements, things like that. Right-of-way for the ODOT, because ODOT has the frontage. And we ended up with around 5.42 acres to work with when you take all of that out. So that would be a net buildable acreage of 5.42. And that would, if you went with the single family housing under the R18, probably around 33, 34 units. And that's using the figures that are there on the screen. Now, if you went with the R2, that would be a comp plan designation of moderate density, so that would mean that there would have to be a change to the comprehensive plan, which is another public hearing that you wouldn't normally have to do if you stuck with the current R18. That would save a few months because we wouldn't have to change the comprehensive plan. But that also brings down today to that 5,000 square foot and a 12.4 dwelling units per acre. So it does increase, you know, pretty much doubles what the minimum density would be. And if you use those numbers with the higher density, probably around 67 units, and you know, 47 single family because of the smaller square foot lots that are in that zone. So the development code does also allow for cottage developments of 5 to 12 units per lot. Yeah, that does require open space, so you do have with those cottage projects, you know, some required open space that you wouldn't have with the triplexes or fourplexes or duplexes. And then we talked a little bit already, the middle housing code amendments. Those are all just going to be type 1A, just come through and get a building permit for those. The multifamily is permitted at that R2 and above, so that that would be one advantage to doing the rezone, would be to be able to do, say, a couple of, sixplexes or something like that, which you could not do if you kept it at the R18. So this was a concept that Amber showed last time, just kind of showing a couple of examples from around the country, what just sort of some of these mixed income with some higher density, units kind of mixed in the middle with some lower density kind of around the perimeter of a project. Again, this would all be completely up to whoever we entered into an agreement with through a request for proposal, and which developer might respond to that and what their plan is. So that would all be up there, but within the RFP, we can of course set some standards for what we want to see as the city. And at this point, given your last workshop, we would include the mixed income. We would also be able to proceed with the wetlands delineation and the traffic impact, using some of those numbers on that prior slide, so we would have that work already done as kind of an incentive. In terms of revenue source, the ARPA funds could potentially be available, since this would be affordable housing for both the wetlands and the traffic impact analysis. The real market value are there. The 8.67 acre parcel is $651,320. The 0.71 acre, $80,950, and the smaller one on Allenwood is $8,090. And as I mentioned, any proceeds at that $1,040,000, since that's what we used to secure the land with in 2005 for parks, would need to go back to parks. Anything above and beyond that, could be used by the council for some other kind of affordable housing incentive. So your call to action, you could direct staff to proceed with the current zoning, leaving it at the R18, completing the wetland study on the 3 properties, direct us to an R1 or an R2 rezone and a comp plan amendment to, we put on here complete a wetland study, but again, that could be either way. I mean, we could proceed with that, whether you decide to rezone or not rezone. And then, looking at the property to the south, the most logical thing would be to assume substreets, so that whenever Greg or whoever chooses to develop that property to the south does want to proceed, there would be 1 or 2 substreets that would give them that ability to tap in and access. So we would get that full flow of traffic through there that would get you 2 access points onto Williams Highway, because right now there would just be the 1 access point using Allenwood. I can go back there and show you that. So here, here's the cul-de-sac today where Allenwood comes in off of Williams on the right side of the screen, and cul-de-sacs in, and then as you come to the south portion here, there's another, Arroyo is the name of the cul-de-sac that terminates here. And then again, this is the property that Greg Jacoby currently owns. So until that develops, you would just be basically using the Allenwood Drive. And then in the future, you would have 2 access points there. So that's what we have. Any questions for staff?
Thanks, Brad. Looks like Valerie has a question.
I do. I want you to go back to, I guess it's slide 12 on the cost implications. Yeah. I want you to clarify what you mean by this. It says proceeds of at least 1.04 purchase price must go back to Parks Land Acquisition SDC or percentage portion of property dedicated to housing. So what does that mean?
I might have to ask Amber, because I wasn't here at the last meeting, in terms of what that, or Aaron, what you talked about, and remind.
So that just is there as a flexibility note if you say you wanted half of it for affordable housing and half of it still as park infrastructure.
Okay. But that would be leaving the other half in the park infrastructure.
So whatever,
Okay.
if you designated a certain portion of this property for park land, then that would not have to be reimbursed to the park fund.
Okay, okay, all right, thank you.
Other
So
questions?
that wetland that we showed on that earlier slide, you know, if that was retained as park, and wetlands doesn't necessarily mean zero development. You know, there's sometimes if you do a boardwalk, you know, or something, if you turn it into almost more like an educational type feature, you know, there can be some ability there to make it into a more sort of educational, functional park site. So
On that note, would that be counted as open space if you were to say do a cottage cluster out there and kept that in parks? Would that be included as, or that as open space?
it could, yeah.
Okay, and so therefore be used as the park so that you didn't have to, so you could take that percentage, use it as an open space requirement, and at the same time keep it and not have to reimburse it? Does it make sense?
Kind of depends on what the developer was to come forth with.
Yeah, I don't know if you can double count open space for cottage being public park. So there's a requirement for open space for cottages, and that's there.
Right.
But that is a requirement for open space for the cottages and the residents that live within the cottage area.
And I guess I'm looking at it in terms of, okay, you buy property, and if you look at the assessed value, it's not anywhere near what we paid for it. So there's kind of a loss thing there. So my thought was you really do have to pay back the whole entire first part because out of that SDC, I mean, because of the park acquisition. So I'm just wondering how flexible we are. We bought the piece of property for $1.04 million. You know, it's been sitting there, and I don't know, like I said, if you look at the assessed value doesn't come to $1.04 million. So there's obviously been a change. So that doesn't count anywhere in there. We still have to reimburse it at the amount that we paid for it. And whose rule is that, just out of curiosity?
Well, I think that's in our municipal code, under the Parks SDCs section of the municipal code.
Okay.
Rick?
So a little bit, that subject interested me, and I was going to ask the same question. So if the wetland portion would determine to be 10% of the entire property, then we could reduce the reimbursement to the Parks District by 10%? Is that how that would work? If we, I realize, left it in a designation that would be parks.
Part of what we're dealing with here is a lack of appraisal, you know, a current appraisal on the property. So, I mean, Aaron and Augustus may have something else, but I think that's an important piece to it.
So it's based by price, not by acreage?
In terms of what goes back to Parks SDCs?
Correct.
Right.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Joel?
So Brad, if I understand it correctly, if it goes to parks, then it can reduce the amount of reimbursement back to the parks, but they can't then count as open space for multifamily development. If it doesn't go back to the parks, then it would increase the amount of money that would go back to the parks, but then that space could count as satisfying the open space for multi-units. Do I have a correct understanding?
Yes. If the entire 8 whatever acres was to go to a private developer, and that private developer incorporated that wetlands portion into their, and it wasn't a public park, then that would be, that would open up the option for them to count that as part of their open space in their development. I think what Aaron was saying earlier assumed that it would stay public. So, yeah, that's the difference there.
Brad, would it be possible for the council to change the code so that if a property was adjacent to a public park, then the open space requirement wouldn't apply?
We could. In fact, we already have in the development code for multifamily, if you're within a quarter mile, I think it is, then you are exempt from having to do that open space on your property. But that doesn't apply to quads or triplexes or, or cottage clusters. So we're really just talking about cottage clusters here because the other middle housing types don't actually have required open space associated with them. It's only the cottage cluster and the multifamily development that have the required open space.
Okay, so if we did triplexes or quads or something on this particular property, then that discussion wouldn't even apply.
Would not even, yep.
Brian?
Yeah, thank you. I had a question regarding the property to the south. You mentioned that they would cooperate with the city in allowing for a road connection through their property. Would it be prudent of us to get an MOU or something in writing before we go too far down this road so we just have a little more certainty? Because that sounds like it's an important piece to this development.
Right. Well, I think it really depends on the number of units, because the fire code only allows up to 30 on a dead end without a secondary emergency access. So, that secondary emergency access doesn't have to be a full-blown public street. I mean, it can be enough just to be adequate for a emergency vehicle. But once you hit that 30 on a dead end, then you do have to figure out another way to get out. So to your question, if we don't need the secondary access for the number of units, then I'm not sure an MOU would really get us much because we wouldn't need it. But assuming that we go more than that, and we would need that access, then yes, I think you make a good point.
Okay, so I know on Allenwood Drive, there's probably already 10 to 12 properties. I'm not sure the exact number, but yeah, it looks like about 10 or 12, at least 10. So if we have anything more than 20 units going in on this property, we would need a secondary access point.
Right.
So, and that's definitely what we're going to be doing. So it sounds like that's a piece that we will need. And the adjacent property owner is going to be putting in more units there. And I don't know how many units connect on that dead end, but I think it's going to make sense once those two parcels are developed that it's, probably a through connection. So it benefits that whole area. So I just want to make sure that's ensured before we get too far down the road of developing, and then we have this variable that may not pan out if we don't have it locked down.
Yeah. No, it's a good point.
Val?
Yeah, and I just want to add to that, just because you're right. If you look around the other lots around the area, they're single-family homes, and so by putting in the mixed use, what you're doing is that road is going to become much more busy. The traffic impact will be greater, and so I would think that you'd have to kind of to have a discussion with the neighbors about that. I'm just thinking, because I know, as it is, I think right now it's written in our code that, it's supposed to be similar to what's there already. And I really do want higher density there, but I'm saying that if you're going to do that, you really do need to have a conversation about, and with Jacoby, if, to see if he's open to that idea, because obviously you're doing something different in that neighborhood than they have there currently. So, that's just my thoughts, is that it needs to be a conversation so that you do have that.
I think Councilor Lovelace brings up a good point. When you're moving forward, there's a number of questions that need answers for us to move forward, and this is one of those. The first one is, do you want to develop it? And then one of the questions is, to what standards do you want to develop it? Current R18 zoning, or potentially in R2 if you go through the process. Now, if you look at the zoning map, it is R18 up and down the corridor there. So you will be doing a spot zone of a higher density there. And that, I think that goes to what you're talking about, is there's going to need to be some information outreach and those kind of things associated with that if you're going to go through those steps, because you will be increasing the density on just that piece of property.
Joel?
Well, and that outreach would be part of the rezoning effort, am I correct in that? Yeah, so that wouldn't be a separate effort on the part of staff, but it would be part that's already, that we would do automatically.
There are minimum standards that you have to meet in order to get that accomplished. And then again, you could take steps and go even further.
Yeah, there is no current requirement to hold an actual neighborhood meeting for a rezone. Now, I'd certainly recommend that, especially if if you're going to move anywhere close to a rezone, then we could just require that in the RFP, that a developer actually do that prior to application. But there, in terms of this, what I'm hearing, what you're wanting to have that level of cooperation that Councilor Levis was referring to, that actually isn't mandated, but we could include that as a requirement in an RFP.
Brian?
So another piece of this is, Allenwood Drive is going to need to be upgraded as part of this. It's not built for that level of density. Could we use our the Arpa funding for the UGB infrastructure to help pay for some of that development that needs to happen for this?
The UGB infrastructure is for water and sewer. So your curb gutter sidewalks would not be an allowable use, but if you need to upsize your, say, water and sewer lines in order to accommodate, then that could be something that we can utilize.
Thank you.
Rick?
Would storm drainage be part of that infrastructure that could be included?
So there's two conversations here in terms of ARPA. You have the UGB infrastructure, but then there's another $2 million that's been allocated by council for other affordable housing development. And I don't think that I don't know if you remember, Augustus, did we look into the stormwater under the UGB infrastructure? I don't think that was included.
I don't think so either.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Are there other questions? No? Okay. Thanks, Brad. Brian?
Well, sounds like there's a lot of steps that need to happen, but a couple of them that are no-brainers are the wetland delineation study. That needs to happen. Traffic impact analysis needs to happen. So, those make sense for us to give direction to move forward on, I think. And then regarding some of the other pieces, to me, it makes sense to go through the process to upzone it to R2, mostly because we're trying to, do everything we can to solve the housing crisis, and this is a small piece of that. R1 only gets us to 33 units, and R2 potentially gets us to double that, to 67 units. So it doesn't sound like a lot, but every little bit helps. So I'd be in favor of moving forward with looking at that rezone, and then we can craft an RFP however we choose. So it takes the neighborhood into account, and we get some density and some mixed income housing there. Yeah, thanks.
Val?
My question is, if we do the rezoning to R2, does that require public hearing and the neighbors? Yes, that's what you asked. I just wanted a clarification on that, because I do, yeah, okay. And in that case, if that's our goal, as long as there's a public hearing involved with that, I would agree that might be the direction to go.
Other people, are you interested in upgrading, upzoning to R2? Rick?
I like the idea of going to R2, but also I see neighborhood opposition coming out of that. Also, just going through the process is going to be very
Cumbersome.
taxing. Not that it's not possible, but it's going to be quite difficult. And my major concern is what the traffic study is going to disclose. So if you go to R2, then of course the traffic study radically changes. So yes, I think this is a hard one because I think, you know, which comes first, the chicken or the egg, and maybe the traffic study will help us make part of our decision.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Other comments? Vanessa?
I support rezoning to R2 as well and moving forward with the wetland study and the traffic impact analysis.
Val?
I just want to clarify what Rick said, that by doing the traffic study, if we decide to rezone, that after the traffic study, we could make a decision based upon, that's just all done before we actually do the rezoning or before we make the final decision?
Well, on the wetlands delineation study, we can start that right away. We can start the traffic impact analysis with, if council does provide consensus and direction that you are going to be upzoning to R2, then that's what the traffic impact analysis would be looking at, is that property at an R2 density. And concurrently, we would also be going through the process of doing the comp plan amendment and the rezone of the R1A property to R2. So it's going to take a number of months to get through all of just those three steps that we've talked about.
Rob?
So if we do a traffic impact analysis based on an R2 zoning, and after public hearings and so forth, we decided we weren't going to go with R2, does that mean you have to have a new traffic impact study based on R1?
I mean, I think we would probably ask them to do both.
Yes, I was going to say, can we?
Honestly, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the big difference, again, with the R2 is it bumps you to that 5 units product. You know, you can still do a 4-unit, 4-plex product with the R1A. You just can't go to a 5-unit product. So that's really the main difference. And in terms of a traffic impact analysis, the engineers would, you know, look at what could you get under that R2. Under the R2, you could, you know, if you did the multifamily, it's gonna, as we showed, probably, you know, double the number of units of potential. But we could ask them to do both, and then we wouldn't need to do it again.
So it would seem to me that traffic impact study would come first, and then deciding what kind of zoning we want on that would come after we have the results of the traffic study.
Yeah.
All right, it sounds like that's what the council's interested in, is pursuing the dual traffic impact study and the wetland assessment at this time, and whatever other steps are needed to consider that rezone to R2. Brian?
So I also want to maybe see how important it is to secure that second access to the property. Is that something that we should work on sooner, or is that something we don't need right now and we can wait until later? I'm just not sure.
Well, I think staff's recommendation would be to continue those conversations, yes, that we've been having with Mr. Jacoby, and bring back to you at the time that we bring back the results of the wetlands and the TIA, some form of agreement. And if we can't reach that, then we would obviously report that back to you. But as you pointed out, we would really need to have some kind of, whether that's a temporary or a permanent.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good to me.
So that second access is a critical piece we're anticipating for the R2 rezone.
Well, probably in the R1A.
Okay,
Yep.
all right. It's all part of the piece
Yep.
package there. Brian?
Yeah, sorry, I just have another question about that. Will the TIA take into account that second access point?
It would.
Okay, thank you.
Anything further on this? Okay. Next up, we have ARPA, affordable housing. Hey, now we have Amber on the stage.
All right. So, for a little bit of background, City Council authorized a little over $1 million to Arpa funds to be used within the Grants Pass urban growth boundary to partner with or develop an affordable housing land bank program. And City Council also authorized $2 million of Arpa funds to be used within the Grants Pass urban growth boundary to incentivize development of affordable housing. On June 13th, Council expressed general support for continuing to explore working with our local housing authorities to foster a local land bank and general support for exploring the potential for working with local partner agencies who have housing initiatives. On July 7th, staff met with representatives from the Housing Authority of Jackson County and the Josephine Housing and Community Development Council to discuss partnering with the city utilizing these ARPA funds to develop affordable rental housing. The Housing Authority of Jackson County and the Josephine Housing and Community Development Council have agreed to form a partnership to utilize ARPA funds to develop affordable rental housing with Grants Pass with Council's blessing. What they would be looking for as a target population would be households earning 60% or below the area median income. And they would be looking to build between 50 and 100 units depending on the site size, with a mix of 1, 2, and 3 bedroom units. Their property size target they would be looking for would ideally be 3.5 acres or larger, with zoning allowing for MFR development. Down below I have an example chart of what 60% area median income is in our area currently. So the partnership structure proposed would be that the ARPA funder would be the City of Grants Pass. Tax credit funder would be the Oregon Housing and Community Services. The owner would be the Housing Authority of Jackson County, forming an LLC registered in Oregon. Project sponsor would be both the Housing Authority of Jackson County and Josephine Housing Community Development Council as co-sponsors. And same thing with the grant applicant. This would be developed with by the Housing Authority of Jackson County, and the tax credit grantor would be the Housing Authority of Jackson County. Same would be the property manager and long-term ownership. And here's the proposed ownership structure for this request. Do we have any questions so far? I realize I'm going a little fast. Yes.
My question at this point is this for future development, right? So
This would be
partnering
for
together.
future development, correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So development costs, land costs, we have $1 million or more for MFR land costs. This can be $300,000 per acre or more. Construction costs right now are averaging about $190,000 per unit, including the Davis-Bacon wage rates. And total development costs are currently averaging at about $320,000 per unit. Cost implications, so our funding sources, the request would be under ARPA funds for land acquisition, pre-development work, and construction costs. The plan would be to utilize low-income housing tax credits with funding from the Oregon Housing and Community Services, as well as private bank financing. Any questions on here so far? Okay. And then the proposed development timeline would be land search and acquisition is currently in progress with the hopes of getting this approved. Funding application to OHCS would be slated to be in late 2023 or early 2024. That would be the application. Construction start goal would be late 2024, and completion we would hope to be by late 2025 or early 2026, so well within the ARPA guidelines of the expenditures and allocation that we need to hit for these funds. So proposed call to action, we do know the date ARPA needs to be allocated by December of 2024 and spent by December of 2026. So we would have a proposed call to action of move to allocate ARPA funds for affordable housing land bank and the affordable housing development to the Housing Authority of Jackson County and the Josephine Housing and Community Development Council for the purposes of land acquisition, pre-development work, and construction costs of program regulated affordable rental housing within the city of Grants Pass. Alternatives, move to additional workshop. I did want to include that if we would want to, I would recommend giving freedom to them to choose their own lot. It's very difficult to find a lot that can fit those constraints, and so allowing them the freedom to utilize the land bank money to find a lot that fits best what their needs are will give them the freedom to move within that time frame best.
Thank you, Amber. Valerie?
Just out of curiosity, how big is the Cathedral Square? I know it's 50 proposed. How large is that? Does anybody know?
I don't know off the top of my head the acreage.
Okay.
Brad can look it up.
Okay, great. I was just curious because that, and then also I know that the proposed Nebraska was a 60 unit, so I was just wondering how many.
Ramsey, Nebraska is 1.56 acres, I believe.
Okay. Okay, just curious. Thank you. I knew that one.
Brian?
Yeah, thank you, Amber. Is this, are they looking at doing, or maybe this isn't even decided yet, but are they looking at doing like one big project, or depending on how much money they get, are they looking at multiple projects?
So at this time, the discussion was one big project.
Okay, thank you.
Joel?
So do they also perhaps reach out to other nonprofits such as Asante or YMCA and see if they can have some joint projects that can accomplish both missions?
I don't know off the top of my head. I do have Tammy here and Brian here. Do you know it?
Please, hang on, please step up to this mic
Yeah.
here and make sure it's on. There's a button right at the base of the mic.
Hello. Yes. So hi, I'm Ryan Haynes. I'm with the Housing Authority of Jackson County. We do work with Asante and YMCA in Medford. We haven't set anything up specifically for this project that we're talking about. We're still looking to find a site first. Yep.
Thank you.
Other questions? Brian?
So with regards to, you know, the parameters that council can put on a project like this, would we, like the Ramsey project, are we able to specify that we want a minimum density or some number of units per acre above and beyond what the code requires?
Generally, these program restricted housings are going to be looking to hit that anyways.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Val?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. I love the idea of the partnership and all that. The only question, and only because I know how hard it is to get through the process and get, you know, and how competitive it is. And I know that, you know, the goal is to get construction in 2024. Do you know if they, like if we were to land bank, get the property and say we didn't get the first round and it went into the second round, would it be an opportunity to work with ARPA and just say, well, we bought the land, we've got it going? I mean, that's my only concern, and I don't want, not want to do it, but I just was wondering where the flexibility was on that.
We believe there's some flexibility there as if you went ahead and moved forward with this project, you would be allocating the $3 million to Jackson County and Josephine County. That would be allocated, that would meet the first round of the December 24. It's allocated, it's there. And as long as progress is being shown, they're starting to construct. They have the contracts associated with the construction of that. I think we're in good shape, and the intent is still there. If at some point the worst case scenario happened and all has failed, we'd be looking at needing to reimburse the ARPA, the money that wasn't spent. But we don't anticipate that being an issue.
And my last question was, and I did see that ultimately the long range, it is owned by the by the Josephine County. Is that correct? Okay. I saw that and I didn't hear that, so I wanted to make sure that was clear.
Joel?
I was just wondering, and this will never happen, but I was just wondering, so if there's cost overruns, and does the project get scaled back, or more funds get allocated? Where do those funds come from? And I realize that hasn't happened and probably won't happen, but in case that does happen, what's the scenario that we're looking at?
So are you asking if the program comes in under cost and needs more funds to complete?
Correct.
Ultimately, it would be down to the Jackson County Housing Authority and Josephine Housing Community Development Committee to work with any funding gaps that come up. I do know that most recently the tax credit program has been backfilling some of the older projects that have dealt with funding gaps because of the COVID years. So it's not impossible to backfill when we have these sorts of discrepancies, but it is fairly uncommon. Usually they're over planned for to make sure that they will hit.
Brad?
That Harbeck and Grandview Cathedral Square is 3.9 acres. That's 56 units.
For this program, are we looking at the city purchasing land or providing a grant to the housing authority to purchase the land?
What was asked ideally was for the Jackson County Housing Authority to have the freedom to choose that lot. I'm unsure if they're wanting us to purchase the lot when they choose it, or if they're wanting the grant to go and look freely.
The concept is that we're providing seed money for them to do a low-income project here in Grants Pass with that $3 million. We're providing that money to the experts in the field to get the project done, and their agreement with us would be that they're going to utilize those dollars to have HUD available housing anywhere from range of 50 to 100. And that's what the $3 million would do. So
I'm just trying to determine, since this involves the purchase of property, where the distinction is between what we've been talking about with the urban campground and what we're talking about here.
So with this project, they would have the ability to find housing that works in the associated zones. So whatever zones that would allow for that housing. So obviously R18 may not meet that standard, but R2, R3, R4 may meet those standards, and they need to comply with all of our current zoning codes.
And who would own the property?
The property would be owned or co-owned by both the authority and the council. And ultimately, I think long range, it was the Josephine County Housing Council that would own the project, with Jackson County Housing Authority doing the development, and I think the first 15 years or something like that of management under the HUD guidelines.
All right. Just a question for me, I guess, why we're not having the same controversy that we've had over the campground grant?
So for the campground grant, right, you're using if you were to use a portion of the ARPA funds to purchase property, at least under the old rules, as I kind of explained last week, then you would have disposition instructions from the federal government. There's new ARPA guidance that came out as part of the final rule that stated that any property that's going to be used for affordable housing, whether that's a rental unit or whether that's for programs that alleviate homelessness, there's a 20-year provision where that property has to be used for affordable housing for at least 20 years. So that's the distinction. We have a grant agreement that said that the party can sell at a certain time, whereas this property would be used for affordable housing and would need to be used for at least 20 years.
At least 20. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, to add on to that just a little bit financially, we have to report that we have given this money to them as well, and they are subject to report back to us what they're using the money on per the ARPA guidelines.
Okay. Any other questions? Check to see. Nothing from DJ. Okay, thanks, Amber. Valerie?
Yeah, I was just going to clarify to you, the big problem that you have with the management is exactly what Josephine County Housing Authority does. They can manage it over those years, and so we don't have to worry about managing it. That's their business. That is their professional business, is the management, property management over long periods of time for low-income housing. So they haven't been in the business of buying and developing land. Jackson County has. So from my perspective, this is kind of like the perfect partnership, because we can't have Josephine County go out and do it, but Jackson County can come over and help us develop it. They've gone through the process. They have Cathedral Hills. They're also the ones that developed whatever the name of that one was out on Maple. Yeah, so they developed that. So Jackson County Housing has been who has developed low-income housing since my husband stopped. So they have the authority, they have everything behind it, and they're trying to partner with Josephine County, which can do the management of it over the long term, and ultimately it becomes Josephine County. There's the last project that was done in Grants Pass years ago was Harbeck Village, and they have just now taken over long-term ownership of that too. So this is a win-win situation from my perspective of being in this business, involved in this business for a long time. So that's how I see it, as coming together to help. And they do know what they've been doing, because they've been doing it for a not long time in Southern Oregon, and are well respected at the state level by Oregon Housing to do that. And that's an important piece of being able to get funding, is to have that history of building and developing low-income housing.
Brian?
Yeah, I think it sounds good. So I don't know what we need to do to move forward. I would assume that something would come to us at a business meeting if council has enough support for this.
That's correct, Councilor. If council says, yes, we want to do this, then we would Augustus would draft up an agreement with the authority and the council, and we would have that for a business meeting for you to approve.
Okay, well, I think that sounds like a good plan. I also think it might be worth, even though they're going to want to build to a higher density just to be more effective, to consider having, a density requirement in the contract. Also, another piece to consider might be requiring a certain percentage of local labor in the contract. I'm not sure if that's feasible or a stumbling block, or how hard that is to achieve, but just so we're not cutting out local contractors on the project.
Other discussion? Rick?
Brian, I'm all for local development, but I know with some of these larger projects, when you get developers don't have the bonding capability, and you find yourself going to somebody outside Grants Pass or Josephine County, but again, not saying that contractor can't subcontract, but I think the biggest stumbling block is going to be the bonding, and Aaron could possibly respond on that as well. Thank you.
Aaron?
Through our conversations of what I think would be most successful for everyone involved and be a win-win is that we do provide them, and we're the granting entity to spark that, but that we allow the freedom for them to go through and find the appropriate property and do the appropriate contracts that they have, because they have a successful model in place. And although if council wants to try to put some additional criteria on there, we can have that discussion. My one concern, without any input from them, would be that may create additional roadblocks or unintended consequences that may hinder the ultimate number of units produced or positive impact to the community. So that would be my one.
Val?
And I would just agree with that. I think the reality of it is they're going to do anything they can to get the biggest, to make it work. And they are the professionals who are doing that. They go for density. That's what they're trying to get, as many units as possible. So, you know, and it brings, you know, like I said, it brings in, they often use, you know, local subcontractors and all those things. So I just think that you leave the professionals to do what they do. So I would hesitate to put any requirements on them at this point in time, because I think that that's what they do for a business, and so therefore it's their business plan and it's worked. So I would go with letting them have that freedom.
Anybody else want to chime in? Vanessa?
Thank you, Brian, for being here today and making yourself available. Thank you, Amber, for bringing this all together and conceptualizing this and bringing it forward to us. I support bringing this forward to a business meeting.
All right, sounds like council's supportive of moving it forward. Do you have anything else you need from us today?
No, I think we've got good direction. We'll work with all the parties involved and look forward to bringing this program to you. Thank you, Council.
Thank you. All right, next up, we're going to be looking at the proposed sales tax ballot language. And I don't have a handout on this one. Is there a handout on this one?
There should have been
Okay.
PowerPoint.
I think I just missed it.
PowerPoint and the ordinance and the explanatory language. Alrighty, so JC and I are going to kind of tag team this one. So it's, we're going to talk about the levy reduction language for the county sales tax ordinance. And so JC will kick it off.
So yeah, what we wanted to do here was give you those different options that Augustus drew up, but then show it financially with some graphs as far as the what ifs. So currently, and as we've been talking about the current fiscal year budget, there's about $6.2 million in the levy and about 3.8 in general fund support. And with the county proposal, they're proposing at about $8 million in revenue. Now I did go back, do my own analysis of their numbers. Generically speaking, maybe it's close. I can't tell you for certain. But in going through the 2017 NICS data, you could see that it could be upwards of $10, $11 million by how you read the actual proposal in the ordinance, and it could be as low as maybe $5 to $6 million. And so in these kind of examples, we kind of did multiple shots of what if it was 4 million, what if it was 6 million, what if it was 8 million, what if it's 10 million, what if it's 12 million, and then show that variability of what that language would be in each one of these instances. So this is just a reminder of where public safety expenditures are in regard to property tax revenues, which includes the levy. And you can see that not all property taxes pay for all of public safety. And then this is all revenues in public safety. And this also includes your TLT, 911, marijuana tax, grants, and some other miscellaneous revenues as well. And you can see from 2012 through about 2017, it was pretty self-sustaining and potentially had funds rolling over from year to year. And as we go into 2022, which is unaudited yet, you can see that there is that gap, there is that discrepancy.
So in terms of the language that can go into the ordinance, we brought before you 3 different options. One has a dollar option or like a figure attached to it. Another is going to be the greater than or equal to the revenue generated by the sales tax. And then a third one is a flexible flexible set of language that says that essentially the city will reduce the levy by an amount that's needed to maintain operations. So we'll start with the reduction of the levy by $1. So upon passage of the LERAT, the Grants Pass City Council shall reduce the property tax levy for law enforcement for all city citizens subject to the levy from $1.79 to 79 cents. Such levy reduction will take place, shall take effect in the following budget cycle or at any other time to be determined by the City Council. City Council shall retain the discretion to make any necessary budgetary adjustments to ensure appropriate city law enforcement funding. So some of the language is going to be similar for all three. Really, the big distinguishing points are by how much the levy is going to be reduced. And so it's to provide a little bit of flexibility for council as to when to make the reduction and when the reduction of the levy will go into effect. And it also, this language also provides discretion for the council to make upward or downward adjustments as necessary to maintain appropriate funding levels. So you'll see with this example, it's a $1 reduction to 79 cents. And this is something for council to consider. You're going to be pigeonholing yourself into reducing the levy by a particular amount without having all of the information about what the revenue for the tax is going to be. So it's just a consideration for council.
Right, and financially, this is what that would look like at each one of those instances. Again, like Augustus is talking about, not wanting to pigeonhole yourself for not just this council, but future councils, because then potentially you're limited to 79 cents in the future. So giving you that leeway to potentially have to increase that over time.
Okay, so this is the language that council originally had asked for in our workshop a couple weeks ago. And this is reducing the levy by an amount greater than or equal to the tax revenue. So upon passage of the LERAT, the Grants Pass City Council shall reduce the property tax levy for law enforcement for all city citizens subject to the levy in an amount greater than or equal to the city's proportional share of the revenue generated by the LERAT. Such levy reduction shall take effect in the following budget cycle or at any other time to be determined by the City Council. The City Council shall retain the discretion to make any necessary budgetary adjustments to ensure appropriate city law enforcement funding.
And this is what this looks like. And so I want you to take a look at the $4 million. So if we were to get $4 million in sales tax revenue, we could still do a 64-cent levy up to approximately that $6.2 million based on that language.
Okay, and this final set of language is the reduction of the levy to ensure sufficient law enforcement funding. So this one's a little bit different in form from the prior two. Upon passage of the LERAT, the Grants Pass City Council shall reduce the property tax levy for law enforcement for all city citizens subject to the levy. The levy shall be reduced by an amount to be determined by the City Council that ensures all funding obligations for law enforcement operations are met. Such levy reduction shall take place in the following budget cycle or at any other time to be determined by the City Council. The City Council shall retain the discretion to make any necessary budgetary adjustments to ensure appropriate city law enforcement funding.
And this is what this looks financially. You can't really see it, I guess, via graph, but all of those levy options, they're still adjustable based on this levy. So even if in the event that we got $8 million, you could do a levy less than the 58 cents that is provided there. That would just keep us at an optimal level of as far as funding public safety.
So this language in particular is probably, it's as flexible as you can get. It doesn't put the council in a position where they're committing to a certain dollar amount for a levy reduction, and it leaves open the door for keeping the levy if absolutely necessary, and to make adjustments based on the revenue for the tax. So some considerations for council are the long-term feasibility of a sales tax for funding law enforcement. There's going to be good years, there's going to be bad years. It's going to be a lot of fluctuation, and that's something that council would need to be aware of in determining what kind of language you want to use for a potential levy reduction. There's always the possibility that the sales tax, as demonstrated in the prior graphs, may not cover the entire cost of law enforcement. You have to think about what if the levy needs to come back, if it's been reduced, what if it needs to be increased after being decreased, and whether or not council wants to close the door on the levy completely, as in eliminate it and then just make the sales tax what it is, and then supplement from general fund. So the call to actions today, because we need to get that language into the county ordinance by Wednesday when they have their second reading. So realistically, I need to send it to them today, tomorrow at the absolute latest. And the call to action is at council's discretion. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Questions, Vanessa?
JC, it's my understanding that we don't have a separate allocation from the levy to police and fire. Is that correct? I tried finding it myself and I couldn't.
Can you restate the question?
So right now, the public safety levy goes to both police and fire, but there's not, that I know of, an itemized allocation to either
That is correct.
division? Okay. How could we possibly delineate what is necessary from the potential sales tax to police only if we don't have that allocation
So
separation?
you have the flexibility to move funding around, so the permanent rate also makes up that. And so if you were to get an influx of sales tax money in, we would just move some of the permanent rate around to go over to fire. And so we would still be in compliance with everything.
It would always just remain fluid, essentially. Thank you.
Other questions? Val?
Yeah, on the, let's see, I'm trying to get this down. The second one, language greater than or equal to. It says upon passage shall reduce property for all citizens subject to the levy in an amount greater or equal to the city's proportional share of the revenue generated by LERAT. Such a levy reduction shall take effect in the following budget cycle or at any other time to be determined by the city council. And then it says the city council shall retain the discretion to make any necessary budgetary adjustments to ensure appropriate city law enforcement. So you're saying under that one, we could still at some point keep a portion of the levy is what we're keeping ourselves open to with that one. So actually, that last statement, which is I think on all of them, it gives us that flexibility. It's just the third one, if I'm not mistaken, just gives us the most flexibility, is what you're saying, correct?
So the one thing I'd like to correct on the statement on, yes, the second option does provide some flexibility for you to keep some of the levy, unless the sales tax brings in so much that it's greater than also the levy itself, and then it would eliminate it.
Okay.
Yeah, to daisy chain on top of that. So basically, anything proportionally above $6.2 million, we would have to end the levy, potentially by the language.
Okay, but we could technically, and I don't know if this is open in all of them, if we did decide at some point, in time to do some a fee on the water for public safety, that also gives us that
There's no mention of a fee or utility fee within that.
Okay, it's
But
just
again, we might be crossing off the levy, not just for this council, but for future councils.
Right, and I understand what you're saying.
Rob?
So with either, I guess any three of these, the levy could go, the amount of the levy retained could go up or down year by year? In other words, 1 year we might not need as much, the next year we might need more or less, so it can go up or down year by year, is that correct?
Yeah, you could always potentially under levy, even though you have an approved levy for up to a maximum of 5 years, and let's say it's $1.79 now and it gets renewed, you could still do less than $1.79.
Sure.
You can't impose more than what it was passed out.
But I mean, it could come down, let's say, well, I guess it's going to expire, but let's just say it was 5 years out. It could come down 1 year, and then the council could bring it back the next year up to the maximum that had been approved by the voters?
That is correct.
So it can come up or down, basically, at the whim of the council?
Just to the limit of what was approved.
Okay.
If
So-
option 3 was optioned as the language. If option 1 or 2 was the language, then you wouldn't have that flexibility.
Well, I don't know, why wouldn't that be true on option 2?
Because you still have, in option 2, you still have to reduce the levy in an amount greater to or equal.
Yeah.
And so you couldn't, if you're still receiving revenue from the sales tax, you wouldn't be able to up it back up to $1.79. There would have to be a
But
reduction.
if the sales tax brought in less in the second year, you could raise from what you reduced it the first year, you could then raise it back the second year up to the amount of the levy, up to the amount of $1.79, right? In either one.
Yes, I think so. If let's say you got $8 million the first year, you could reduce the levy to 0. 5 million comes in the next year, you do a small amount on the levy.
Up to the 6.2. So in that
Right.
example, you'd only be able to charge about $1.2 million,
Right.
not
But it-
the full $1.79.
Okay. So, okay, so it can come up, or it basically can go up or down year by year, and the people won't really know until we get our results.
Well, there's
what the-
only 2 years left on this levy.
So then, if it, okay, then this levy expires, and we are, say, going back, what is it, in '24, we got to vote on it again? 24 is when this one would expire, so we then would have to go out for potentially a levy, and we wouldn't necessarily know how much we're asking the people for, because it could go up or down year by year.
I mean, I would hope that we would have at least 1 year of revenue of the sales tax, and then you could kind of adjust accordingly to what we would be asking the public.
Okay, thank you.
Brian?
Yeah, thank you. So in all 3 of these options, there's that last sentence that says the city council shall retain the discretion to make any necessary budgetary adjustments to ensure appropriate city law enforcement funding. Is that it's like a fail-safe valve, so all the other language above that really doesn't matter because that gives council the discretion to do whatever we want?
So it is a fail-safe in a way. And like we've kind of been discussing with the first 2 sets of language, right? The first set of language, you're reducing the levy by $1. If it needs to go back up, it needs to go back up. Again, not past the maximum amount set. For the second one, it's equal to or greater than the revenue received. But yes, in a way, it is a fail-safe to allow council, if they absolutely need to make sure that everything's being funded adequately. Yes, it is designed as a fail-safe for that.
So to clarify that fail-safe, it's what about 10 years from now? So that $10 million gap today is going to be well above that in 10 years. So not wanting to potentially rule it out in ordinance that you would never be able to bring it back.
Thank you.
Joel?
Well, it seems like that also describes the existing situation. So for example, when we put on the fee on the water bill, I don't know if any of us were on the city council at that time, but the city council had the discretion to make any necessary adjustments, and what they did is they put it on the water bill. And so it actually just describes the existing situation. You just have a little bit more flexibility because the levy's thrown in also. That's what we do every year with the budgeting process.
Vanessa?
With any discussion around elimination of the levy, is the needs of the fire department considered?
Oh, yeah. So these numbers are with the fire department included.
And the sales tax is only for law enforcement funding?
That's how it's written, correct, but then we would move permanent funding from the permanent rate into more fire and then delineate what is kind of split back over to police.
Just so that I'm clear, right now, all of our permanent funding is allocated to the police division?
I don't think it's all of it. I think it's proportionately given to both, and both are currently short, if you want to look at it like that.
Okay, and so the sales tax hypothetically could replace that, and then from there, that's where fire would be made whole?
Yeah.
Understood, thank you.
I have a question about slide 5, the revenues versus expenditures. So we're showing, I don't know what the exact amount is here, but at least 1 million difference right now. And this is just, I'm assuming this how are we accounting for growth, I guess, and closing this gap?
And that's the issue, right? You're maximized at 3% per property taxes, and so this gap is going to continue to grow if it stays proportionate.
So if the levy, if the sales tax replaces the levy and just at the $6.2 million level, we will still have a deficit in public safety that we will have to deal with.
Yeah, more or less, you'd be trading the problem we have today with the same problem, just a different funding source.
But added to that, and I will say, that does, which, as Joel said now, we do have the discretion that if we want to put something in the water bill to do something, that is what had happened in past in emergency situations. It is, and that, at that point in time, that was an emergency situation that needed to be dealt with, and it got dealt with. And I don't think there's a single citizen back from that time that was not in support of having a jail and paying $3.69 to have that jail there. I mean, I'm sure there are people that weren't, but I'm just saying that was a situation where it needed to happen. And I think that I believe that I would like to go towards diversification because I don't like having everything just property tax. That's what would ultimately be my future hope, is that we're not just relying on one, but we're opening ourselves up to other options to diversify, and therefore not. I think anytime you just have all your balls in one basket, that you're setting yourself up for a problem.
Do we have other questions, or are we moving on to discussion? Rob, is yours a question?
No.
Okay, Vanessa?
I'm sorry, I had to step away for a moment. Would you mind restating your analysis that you had said in the beginning?
Yeah, so I looked at the 2017 data that was referenced in the county email that we got last week or the week before that. And in doing so, if you take the look at the treetop of the data, that $8 million probably isn't that far off. But when you drill down into some of the data and the exclusions, you have to make certain assumptions. And so in those assumptions, Josephine County approximately in 2017 got $1.2 billion in retail sales. Within retail sales, there's about $250 million worth of car sales. So setting up what's the average, because we were going to hit a $2,000 maximum, you're going to start crossing things off the list as far as what sales are going to generate this tax revenue. So the further I delved into it, the more the decreasing of the amount.
Thank you.
Brian?
Yeah, I just have a question about the language again on the second option, which is slide 8. So at the top it says Grants Pass City Council shall reduce the levy, and then below it says City Council shall retain the discretion. So those are both shalls. So, you know, is there a priority, or, I mean, you know, how can you have two shalls when they're contradicting each other?
Reducing the levy, as in you will reduce the levy, is not in conflict with having discretion. You can reduce the levy by an amount greater than or equal to the revenue, but you're going to also have, I don't see why both shalls are conflicting.
So council shall reduce the property levy, but council shall retain discretion to not reduce the property levy. That's what the last sentence is saying. It's saying that
that council shall retain the discretion to make any necessary budgetary adjustments.
Which would include not reducing the levy.
Right, but that's not what it says.
But that's not the wording, but that could be an outcome of that sentence.
It absolutely can be an outcome of that sentence.
Okay.
But I mean, it's, if you want the discretion, then it has to be in there. But if you don't want the discretion, you can take it out. That's definitely within your power. But the way that this language is written, there's no explicit conflict.
Okay.
So just to reiterate too, the intent is to, yes, reduce it at the point it gets passed. But 10 years from now, if that last sentence isn't in there, you don't have the option of getting the levy back potentially because your revenue may be above that $6.2 million. And so the intent is to definitely go through the process of reducing the levy, but not make it so it's concrete to where you'll never be able to, as a council, bring it back.
Is it a question now, Rob?
So when you said you were analyzing the exclusions, the other evening, I should say, Commissioner DeYoung didn't really have a definition for what light-duty vehicle sales were. Do you have a definition for that now?
No, but I also, the ordinance is written to say all services, which includes healthcare. And if you read the email, they excluded that in the data, which is kind of contradictory of what is a service still. And so the ordinance just says services, and there's no exclusion for what kind of services that can and can't be taxed. So your accountants, your lawyers, your things like that, they are subject to the tax as well. And so that's where it kind of gets ill-defined of, there probably needed to be a little bit better definitions made as to what was all included or intended to be included. Because the way I read it, it's everything. And then the only exclusions are those retail-like things that are in the ordinance.
So it could be on the vehicle sales, it could basically be all vehicle sales are excluded except for maybe heavy-duty trucks or trucks of some nature. So it could be all passenger car vehicles, it could be maybe light-duty trucks, all excluded, but we don't know.
That is correct.
Thank you.
Other questions? Joel?
So I'm just struggling a little bit with option 2, greater than or equal to the revenue. Shouldn't that be lesser than or equal to the revenue? Or does that make it like option 3? I'm not sure why we would reduce the levy greater than what the amount of money being brought in by the sales tax if it was approved.
Good point.
It would be less than or equal to, correct?
Well, it's up to us to write it, I guess, but I think the intent here is that, is to balance it out, that basically we wouldn't be collecting the levy if we didn't need to. So as long as the sales tax brought in at least $6.2 million, then the levy would be completely eliminated. And
Right.
if it
As long as it's
were,
less than or equal to, yeah.
well, it's reduced by the amount.
Reduced by the amount.
Does that make sense? I mean, that's just a simple correction, but I've struggled with that, and maybe I'm not seeing something.
I think it's just in the way the statement comes across and the way it's written. I understand the less than or equal to provides even additional flexibility. The greater than and equal to is more of an ideal circumstance where you're saying at least you're going to get, we're looking at totally reducing as much as possible or equal to. So I think it's just a statement. And also I just wanted to mention I was asked by Commissioner DeYoung to at least let council know that he would like council to consider option 1, as option 1 provides for a designated dollar amount that the levy would be reduced, and it seems to be easier to calculate for individuals to take a look at what the reduction would be. So I wanted to forward that to you as he asked for me to do that.
If you do that, I won't agree to it. Go ahead, Joel.
I just wanted an answer to my question. Should it be less than rather than greater than? I heard what Aaron said. He said it was just in the wording, but those two things are different.
So you reduce the levy at an amount less than or equal to the city's proportional share of the revenue, and less than, I guess you'd kind of have to determine at that point in time how much less than the amount you're going to have to reduce the revenue, the levy by.
Right, and where I struggle a little bit is when would we ever reduce it greater than? I can still fund adequately the public services.
Right, so that's, I think it's a valid question, but this is making an assumption that the tax is going to bring in a lot of revenue. So say it brings in that $12, you'd be able to eliminate the levy completely, theoretically.
Statement 2 basically states that whatever the revenue is coming in, city council will reduce the levy equal to that amount without discussion.
And without needing to be exactly precise on the equal to, because that could be a very, hard thing to calculate. So it gives a little bit of leeway there.
I think also the intent of the language is to show that cap of that $6.2 million. So anything above that would be the full reduction of. I think that's the intent there.
Okay, so kind of like a dangling modifier.
But Councilor King, you do bring up a good point, additional flexibility. Maybe it's a fourth option. The fourth option would be less than or equal to. That would provide additional flexibility with regards to what to do with the levy.
Okay, thank you. My English, I have dangling modifiers all the time, and when I look at it, then I got to correct them. Okay, thank you.
Do we have other questions? No? All right. I think we're ready to move on to discussion here. Thanks, guys. Rick?
So my concern, while I think the preferable language could be less than, it leaves the door open for us as a council, to me, not to reduce the levy amount. And I think that's a real negative going to the voters. Thank you.
Brian?
So I won't dive too deep into it. I don't think the sales tax is the best way to fund our most vital services. But in the spirit of giving this thing the best chance to let the voters decide, the language on option 2, and my thought with this is the ballot language needs to be as straightforward and as simple as possible, so that the voters don't, so everyone can understand it. So the changes that I would make, in the first line it says, upon passage, council shall reduce the current property tax levy. So that just makes it so, it's understandable that, it's not going on into forever. But the levy that we have right now will be reduced, and it will be reduced in an amount equal to the city's share, just equal, not greater than, not lesser than, nothing else, just equal. So it's dollar for dollar reduction. Whatever we get in sales tax, that's how much the levy is reduced. And then I personally am not comfortable with that last line, giving council discretion to make any other changes, because that's, that does not, if I was a voter, I would see that as an out for council to do whatever they want, regardless of what the other language says. So I would take that last line out. Thank you.
I have a question for JC regarding the equal to or greater than. Or Augustus, it doesn't have to be JC, but if we say equal to without any sort of flexibility, either on the less than or more than side, is that hard to implement?
Yes. We would need to know what those revenues would be. So right now we have an estimate, right? So I wouldn't want to put you in a position where we're hard and fast on that $8 million, which is obviously more than the $6.2 million levy. And so I would say we would want to wait to make sure that those are confirmed as far as what we would see before we make that reduction.
I'm just wondering almost even if, let's say it brought in 6.18 or something, that's really not quite equal to, you know, then do we keep a levy that brings in $200,000 or?
We could definitely bring that back to council if it were that close and talk about what your options are based on the language that we're talking about today.
Okay. Saw some other hands over here. Discussion points. Rob?
Well, you know, when we talk about, and I appreciate, Brian, your efforts to try to make that more clear for the general public, to give them any possible chance of thinking that it's reasonable and straightforward. You know, I really have to question and/or caution the council that while we've heard several times, Valerie many times now has said she really believes diversification is important, okay, and that I could embrace that concept, but that is not at all how we started these discussions. That's not what is in our strategic plan. It was all about studying permanent funding, not diversification, but permanent funding. So I would very much like to caution the council that if you're going to use the term permanent funding, you better be sure it's permanent, because if you remember back several months at a meeting, I said that there really is no such thing as permanent funding, and Adam Schultz completely agreed with me. And I pointed out, there was an example that he gave from a city up north, I can't remember which city, where they had a public safety taxing district. They passed it. Possibly the public was told it was a permanent solution, I don't know. But 10 years later, they needed a levy again. So what we've heard here, there are so many variables and so many balls in the air to even attempt to go out and continue to call this a permanent funding solution is going to set us up to be liars at some point in the future, because we see it's not permanent. Unless somehow the sales tax does exceed all expectations, and we're all just rolling in dough, county and city, and everything's wonderful, and we can't figure out where to spend all the money. That could happen. We could, you know, bring in a lot more than we're assuming. But if we don't, and to continue to call this thing permanent, we'll basically make a liar out of anyone who used that word. So if you want to call it diversification, that's fine, but that's not how these discussions started. They started with the word permanent. So with that in mind, I would, you know, I agree with Brian's points on the modification of option number 2. However, if the sales tax does bring in more than our 6.2, does bring in 8 or 10 or whatever, you know, that's more than we could reduce the levy because it exceeds the levy. So we would need some discretion there. Otherwise, we're going to be getting, you know, millions more for funding in public safety than we have right now, which I don't think was the original goal. So if you understand my point, but yeah, I'm done.
Yeah, I think you're right, Rob. I think permanent, I mean, when you're looking 10, 15, 20 years, there's no permanent because we don't know where we're going to be and what's going to happen. So I think what we probably should use is stable, because stable to me is a better explanation of what we're really trying to do, is doing some sort of stable funding source, and it will always have to be to a certain discretion because we don't know, you know, what costs are going to go up and that sort of thing. So, you know, ultimately, I mean, if you think about it, right now, $500,000 of the public safety that we're paying is for their building, which will be paid off in 10 years. So, you know, that's something to think about. 10 years from now, that will no longer be there. And so, but we don't know at that point in time, we'll need a new fire station. I mean, you know what I'm saying? These things change and they go on. And so permanent is, it's a fallacy. There's no such thing as permanent. But my hope with diversification is stability, that, you know, and unfortunately there is not a lot of trust. I will say one thing I did like about reading the the ordinance that the county put on there is that there is a tax board, meaning that it does not just go to the county commissioners to decide, but there is a board which made up a city person and a Cave Junction person, whatever, to help oversee the funding. So it's not just the county. And I have had some people saying that they would not support something if it just went and was controlled by the county commissioners. So I was happy to see that they actually established a tax board in their ordinance. But I think that stable is what we're looking for. And I think that part of the whole thing, the only way that this is going to happen is if it is sold. If we think that just by putting this on the ballot that people are going to vote for it, I can guarantee it will not happen. I think we all know that. The only way that this is a possibility is if we start using stable funding, if we start using offsetting this and offsetting that, and those pieces, because this isn't just for the survival of the city, this is for the survival of our sheriff. And we've all been down that road too many times to know we don't want to go down there. And I think a lot of citizens don't want to go back there either. So we can squabble over greater than and less than, make a teacher crazy, or we can, I think probably the best bet is the second one, is greater than less than, but you have to keep in there to retain the discretion, because I don't want to take my discretion away if there's something that happens and we need funding, because that is just, that's our role. Our role is to provide public safety for our citizens. So that's kind of where I am right now, is just stable is what I'm looking for. I understand now a little bit more of Vanessa's concern, because she was worried about fire and how does fire go in and play into the role of this. But as long as we have that public safety, we can shift funds and take the sales tax and move it over to the police and law enforcement, and take the money that the law enforcement's being relieved of and move that over to the fire. So as long as we have that flexibility, I think the public needs to be aware of that as well, and that it is just looking for stability in a way, not just to help us, but to help Cave Junction, for crying out loud. Where are they at, and where have they been the last 25 years? They need our help. Joel.
I just want to compliment the staff for doing the sensitivity analysis. That's a first-rate job. And it takes a while for the reader to understand it. But when you look at the red, that is the under the different amounts that the sales tax would bring in. It's interesting, under all alternatives, given the existing condition, none would make the general fund would draw more resources from the general fund. And most of the options on all of the alternatives in terms of how much money would bring in would reduce the general fund subsidy of the public safety department, which was interesting. The other interesting thing that I found was the reduction in the levy, the blue part, in all alternatives across the amount of money, the sensitivity analysis, and how much money the retail sales would bring in. And of course, under the first one, that amount is constant regardless of how much money it brings in, because we reduce the levy by $1. And under that, with the 4 different scenarios or 5 different scenarios on how much money the levy would bring in, 4 or 6 of them, 5 out of the 6 would reduce the general fund obligations, which is, that's a good thing in terms of future funding. On the second option, the levy reduction being equal to the revenue that was being brought in, the general fund drawdown would be the same under the $4 million and $6 million generated by the retail tax, and but that doesn't do anything in terms of that gap that we looked at the beginning. And so, the sensitivity analysis, it's risk management. How much is it going to bring in? And I appreciate your analysis and what you did on that. So then I look at, well, what's the objective of this exercise? Well, the objective of this exercise is to fund our public safety at the existing levels of service. So I think whatever we put on the ballot needs to accomplish that objective. The objective is not necessarily to form a ballot measure that would pass if it doesn't accomplish that objective. So when I look at that, I look at option 3, obviously, would do that. And it would reduce the gap in the future. Option 2 has more in the red than option 1. So in terms of my analysis of this great analysis that you've done for us, and I appreciate that, I would either favor 1 or 3. And if it doesn't pass, it doesn't pass, but if it does pass, it would accomplish our objectives. Whereas I'm not sure that option 2, if it passed, would accomplish the objectives. And I don't want to have a ballot measure that the citizens pass and then it doesn't accomplish the objectives of covering that gap and funding future services. So I'm okay with option 1 or option 3, and actually, as I look at this and I think about it more, the option 1 probably has a higher chance of passing than option 3 because there's no lack of trust in option 1 because the amount is reduced by $1. It does make me a little nervous in the $4 million to $6 million if it's going to bring in that much. And so maybe in terms of the objective of funding public safety, we need to go with option 3, and if they don't trust us, they don't trust us, and it fails.
Rick, then Vanessa.
I'm sorry, did you say Rick
I
then?
said Rick and then Vanessa. Did you have your hand up? Okay, go ahead.
Brian used the word straightforward, and I think option 1, levy by $1, is the most straightforward thing, and it's easy to understand. You don't have to read the fine print. But as Joel said, it brings in some liabilities with it. And I guess I would be willing to accept those chances with the idea that it would show support and possibly have a chance of passing by using option 1. Thank you.
Vanessa.
I don't know how we could possibly sign on to option 1 when this is data from 5 years ago that's barely verified to be correct and accurate. I don't even know how that's a possibility. And I would agree with Councillor Lovelace that it is the objective of the council to secure stable funding for both police and fire services. Permanent funding is no longer really an option in the state of Oregon from rules brought down by the state legislator on caps on property taxes. And if the council is looking for stable funding for our most vital services, this isn't it, to be frank. There's no contingency to this. In the event of a recession or another global pandemic in which consumer spending is halted, we simply are not funding our police services, which I find extremely troublesome, and I don't think it's discussed enough. That's really all I have to add.
Rob.
Yeah, Joel, I think you brought up some good points. I think everyone has actually on, we'll say, the politics versus the practicality of these 3 different options. I think that staff did a good job bringing forward what council had asked them for. However, I also think that part of this, we didn't ask for an analysis of, but I'm going to try to offer one, of where actually will this additional money come from. I mean, when people in the past have used the term permanent funding, I've always thought, and I think I've said, that's always code for we need more money, because there's no permanent source, but permanent always means we need more money. Okay. So with that being a given, where is the money going to come from here? most of us probably read Tom Bradbeer's analysis, and I think I can tell you from being a small landlord myself and a homeowner, he's right on with as far as the increases of cost to property owners, meaning that there was a roof that I priced a couple years ago that was $7,500. It's now $12,000, same roof. So I am pretty darn sure that even though if the sales tax were to pass and the safety levy were to be reduced, renters are not going to see a reduction in their rent, I guarantee you, because the cost of doing almost anything on a property is up 40 to 80 to 100% right now, and I haven't raised my rents 40 to 80 to 100% in the last couple of years. So if the safety levy goes away, renters are not going to see that. What they are going to see is a sales tax. So the renters in Grants Pass will essentially be paying twice. They'll be paying double. They'll be paying what they were paying for the levy through their rents. They then will be paying the sales tax on top of it. And that's where the additional money is going to come from, primarily. There's going to be a little bit additional with our summer tourists, but the majority, it's not like we're a town whose population quadruples in the summer. It's not like that. The majority of the sales tax can be paid by local people year-round. And more than 50% of those people are renters. They're going to be paying twice. They'll be paying whatever's left in the levy, or they'll be paying what they were paying for the levy in their rent. They'll be paying for the sales tax. So that's actually kind of a, I'll say, from a macro perspective, that's where the money's coming from, is from double taxing renters. Okay? Now, we may all say that that's worth it because we need to have stable public safety funding. I'm not going to say that. Some of you might be okay with that. But that's my analysis of where the money is actually going to come from to basically come up with the additional for public safety funding. It's coming from double charging renters who will not see a reduction if the sales tax passes, but will be paying sales tax.
We're not making any progress on options 1, 2, and 3 here on the ballot language, just FYI.
Yeah.
Valerie.
Well, I was just going to say, I do thank Joel for bringing forth the second one and looking at the number of red in choice 2. Because you're right. It's just like, oh, yeah, that's the red is where we don't want to be. I'm just going to remind those of us on the council that in looking for stable funding, we have had a lot of information thrown at us that's not right here right now that we've talked about in terms of increasing the size of the pipe for water and doing something there. There have been other options. Medford has a public safety funding. I mean, we have looked far and wide. And I think the reality of it is that we still might have to think far and wide. That's just a reality. And so I also read Tom Bradbeer's, and I totally always appreciate what Tom Bradbeer brings to the table, because he is, but once again, the reality of it is we need more stable tax source, and we can't just depend. I think he also mentioned in there that it's like 20% of the property in Josephine County is what people paying for public safety, because if you're a nonprofit or the amount of property that belongs to state governments, state, city, federal, in our particular community is huge, and we have to. That's our reality. So we can't keep squeezing the property tax. So we have to do something. So based upon what Joel said, I'm willing to shoot for the third one and say, as I've said before, the passage of this depends upon the community, and I will listen to what the community says. If we put it out to a vote, that's why I believe in voting. But I also believe in bringing the community as best as possible along on the benefits of not having our public safety simply be at this point in time on property tax. So I think you're right, Joel. I think there has to be a certain trust. We have to trust that we can do the best we can to go out and talk to the community and let them decide where to go. So I would be willing to go for number 3.
Brian.
Oh, I was just going to maybe recommend that we, get a tally and and move this along.
Sorry, and not to muddy this up anymore, because I'm hearing from some counselors, you know, the request to have it by some sort of hard monetary amount. If council would want to entertain, instead of $1, we're assuming that 29 cents is $1 million, but you can put an amount that the levy is going to be reduced by in 29-cent increments and say, all right, this is what we're reducing it by no matter what's happening, at least for right now. And then council can have discretion to raise it based on the revenues that come in. So you'd basically be seeing a marriage of the first option. Instead of $1, it would be by either 29 cents or 29 cents twice. I can't do that math very quickly. And then you'd have the last provision that provides flexibility, and that is if council's wanting to put a hard number on the reduction of the levy right up front.
Thank you. Well, as far as the tally goes, what I have written down here is that Joel and Rick have spoken up in support of number 1 being the most straightforward. Brian and Valerie spoke in favor of number 2 and the council's intent to reduce the levy. But then Valerie and Joel have also spoken in support of level 3 and the amount of discretion and possible increase in revenues that would bring in. I have that Rob and Vanessa have spoken, but I'm not exactly sure where they stand on preferences. And DJ is listening in. I haven't heard from him yet. Brian.
That was a long silence. Do we need like a motion to move this forward? Could someone
Sure.
do that? Okay, it's not going to be me, but
Okay.
somebody could.
All right.
I just want a little bit more clarification. I had a distraction there. So you're saying, and 29 cents is such a hard number to deal with that I'm going to go 30 cents. So 30 cents is a lot easier for my little mathematical brain to figure out than 29 cents. So if you're saying that we could technically say 30 cents a million is about $1 million. 30 cents on the levy is approximately, it would be a little over $1 million. So you're saying that we could say, give me an example of how we could do that in a simple matter, because that's what I'm looking for, the same thing. I mean, I don't want to talk about 29 cents per thousand because that's going to rattle my brain. And remember, I've got a fifth grade brain, but that's kind of where most people will be coming from.
So it'd basically be option 1, except it's not reduced by $1. So if we're looking at 30 cents per million, and you can choose how many millions you want to reduce it by. $1 is pretty steep. That's 3 million by our quick math. It can be a different amount, an amount that council might be comfortable with saying up front, this is what we're going to reduce our levy by, instead of $1. Just so that there's a hard dollar amount. So this language would read from reduce the levy from $1.79 to $1.19 if it's by 60 cents.
I'd almost go back to the $1 because I think it's the same thing. I think you don't want to do too much math. I think that if I've been all over the place, and I'll continue to be all over the place because I'm trying to figure this out, and I agree that we need to keep it as simple as possible, because if you're going to go out there, you got to keep it simple. So we're saying, no, we're not going to get rid of the levy, but we are going to take $1 off, and we're going to do whatever. And so if we did that, the council discretion also gives us the upward or downward adjustments to maintain our current levy funding levels or above. Give me clarity on that.
So I think what Augustus is getting at is to give that sense of the surety for the citizens that first year, no matter what, it will be that 30 cents reduction, and allow for the analysis of what the revenues would potentially be, like in the language in number 2. And so it's that that guaranteed promise of this is what it's going to go down by, and then also give you the time potentially to see what revenues actually do come in as.
Okay. And I think people will understand that we can't make something because we don't know. We don't know. It's all going to be the next year or two getting an idea of what that kind of funding is. So I think they'll understand that. So I just don't know how to make a motion to make it happen.
Joel, then Rob?
Well, the other thing I'm looking at on slide 2, which is the current situation, the red is $3.80. That's the what comes from the general fund. Under $1, that amount, if we reduce the levy by $1 on slide 7, that general fund obligation goes down from 380 to 326 at 4 million, or 1.26 million with a $6 million one. So with the reduction of the levy by $1, the general fund subsidy of the safety forces, public safety, goes down, even in all alternatives. So that's significant. If you reduce that by $1 or reduce that levy by less than $1, then it's possible that you could increase the subsidy of the general fund, which would be adverse to the objective of the exercise and putting it before the voters to start with. So I think you have to, if you're going to reduce the levy by a certain amount, it has to, $1 would be a reasonable amount given the sensitivity analysis, and the subsidy of the general fund then would go down. And I know this is hard to follow if you're just looking at my words. So I would hesitate to reduce the levy by less than $1 because it might increase the subsidy of the general fund.
All right, it was just a thought. So.
Yeah, Rob?
So, JC, you said something about, it'll be tough to know or impossible to know the first year what the sales tax brings in, or we won't know, et cetera. So if this were to pass in November, theoretically, collections would start in April of '23. Okay. So in November, we will all have paid our property tax our property tax bill in full. The following November of 23, we still won't know what the sales tax is brought in. That's correct, right? So we will end up paying our full property tax and full levy again in 23. So, and then at that point, the next year, the levy expires, right? So I'm not exactly sure when people are going to see their levy bill go down. Can you explain when they might see that, even, a year or more into the sales tax?
I think it all depends. I believe the county said quarterly installments would be paid. So we would potentially know July-ish what that is looking like, maybe August. That will potentially be past the budget process that we do in April and May. So there could be that lag in information and being able to reduce the levy. But at the end of 24, there is the option for us to go either back out for a levy, or if the revenues are coming in well above, that we wouldn't have to go back out for that vote.
So so we could potentially reduce a levy assessment based on a quarterly, our first quarter of the sales tax coming in 23. It's unlikely that anyone would do that, but it's possible that we would have tremendous confidence or something. Okay, so 23, we would end up, okay, we could either reduce it based on an initial amount coming in, or we'd end up waiting to the following year, I guess, until we had a full year's worth or 6 months worth of it coming in. So, okay, so either we do it by looking at an early return with our first quarter or whatever, or basically people are going to pay their levy amount again in 23.
Yeah, so maybe let me say it back to you and how I think I'm hearing you say it. in the language in number 1 where we reduce by $1, we would be under levying at that point, and so the following November, it wouldn't be on there. But if we were to wait and give that flexibility, the full $1.79 potentially would be levied out. Is that kind of saying back what you're...
Yeah, thank you.
Somebody make a motion.
Bill, we're
I
kind of
will.
at a standstill here.
I'll make a motion.
Go ahead, Val.
Well, I'm going to make a motion to go with $1. Language reduction levy by $1, because to me, it's the simplest right now in the short amount of time that we have to get an idea of what it might bring in. It's pretty simple, and I think at this point in time, we need to go with simple. So I would make a motion to go with $1, first one.
Is there a
by
second
Rick.
from Rick? Discussion on that? Rob?
Okay, so as we're having this discussion, and I realize that there's probably even more questions today than answers, and there were more questions the other night than answers, I'm going to recuse myself from this vote, and there were enough people on the council the other night who thought this was a good idea, that it'll still end up being on the ballot, but there's so many uncertainties that I don't want to have my name associated with this thing a year or 2 or 3 from now. So I'm going to recuse myself from the vote.
Yeah, I don't understand the difference between a
Because
recusing
I'm
and a no.
I'm not against the concept of putting this on the ballot. I'm against the concept of putting this group of specifics on the ballot. I just don't think it's clear enough to people. I don't think they necessarily understand that.
Well, the vote would be on the language of the ballot measure there, not on the concept of moving it forward to the voters.
Okay,
I also want to correct something that I've heard a couple of times. I've heard ballot language. This is not ballot language. This is ordinance language. This is what's going to be in the ordinance that declares and defines, and what would ultimately adopt it, and declares and defines actions.
Okay.
And you'll see the explanatory statement and all of that before it gets filed on the 19th, because this is going to kind of inform what the explanatory statement looks like when it comes to how the city is reducing its levy.
Okay, so this is what we're asking to be put into the commissioner's ordinance regarding our intent
For
for
the
Okay.
second reading on Wednesday.
Okay, that does help somewhat. But anyway, the decision now, Valerie made the motion to reduce the levy by $1, assuming upon passage of LRAT. And is there discussion on that, Brian?
Yeah, so the motion leaves in there the last sentence that council shall retain the discretion to do whatever they want. Okay, thank you.
Further discussion? Vanessa?
I think the confusion came because on our agenda, it's listed as sales tax ballot language.
DJ?
Well, yes, it certainly is a complicated topic. I generally agree that I now have so many more questions about, how to say this. I totally respect that we need to not pigeonhole ourselves or dedicate something that we don't know what it is, but also demonstrating that, this is part and parcel to reduce the levy with whatever funds that we have. And, so it seems at this point, my item of contention for this decision is aligning ourselves with an exact amount. We have speculation onto what that revenue source is going to be like, but, I can't dedicate to that. What I would like to dedicate to is wording in the ordinance that, we will, and our intent is to reduce the levy by an amount that is determined by revenue, and then keeping the discretion open for that. So I think for those reasons stated, I'm going to have to say no to dedicating to $1, but would very much so like language that demonstrates reduction of the levy, but not by a certain amount.
Thank you. Joel?
So when we're making policy decisions, all decisions come with risk. And the sensitivity analysis allows you to assess that risk and to deal with it in hopefully an upper brain manner. And so reducing the levy by $1 with the sensitivity analysis reduces the funding of public safety on the general fund across all incomes of all projections of income from the retail tax, which is what our objective is in funding and maintaining the public safety and trying to offset that if we can with property tax relief. So risk management wise, I think option 1 minimizes the risk, looks at accomplishes the objective if it passes, and it's very straightforward. So I'm going to be voting for that, and then let the public decide.
Is that another hand, DJ?
Yes, it is. Thank you for that point of view, Joel, that addressed, my concern about, being aligned with a certain amount. And my apologies if this has been asked and clearly covered, but I'm not entirely clear on it quite yet. If this does pass and we don't get $1, what does that mean? If we don't, that makes up for a $1 in levy.
So DJ, can I answer that for you? On slide 7. So there's the green is the projected amount. In each line is a different alternative of how many dollars the levy or the sales tax would bring in.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if the levy brings in the lowest, which is like a 50% of projected, or I don't know how much it is of projected, maybe less than that, which is the third line down, the $4 million, then it would require $3.26 million subsidy from the general fund. When you look back over on slide 2, the current subsidy of the general fund for public safety is $3.80. So the reliance on the general fund, even at the minimum amount of money coming in from the dollar levy, would reduce the amount of general fund subsidy. And that reduction projected would be from $3.8 million under the most severe scenario down to 3.26.
Got it. Thank you very much for explaining that again. It's crystal clear this time.
Valerie?
And once again, that brings it back to something simple and tangible, which is, once again, I think something that we really need to have if we're going to be successful and be able to explain it moving forward to the public.
All right, are we ready to vote on this motion? Okay, so the motion was to reduce the levy by $1 as indicated in our option number 1 here. And Valerie, how do you vote?
Yes.
Brian?
No.
Vanessa?
No.
Rick?
Yes.
Joel?
Yes.
Rob?
Recuse myself.
DJ?
I believe in it, yes.
All right, motion passed. 4 to 2 to 1 abstention, I guess. With a motion like this, what's the process? I have no intention of signing this, so.
So I will draft the language that appears in option 1.
I will send it over to the county for inclusion in their ordinance, and then it'll get read into their ordinance during the second reading on Wednesday.
So what's the process for the mayor to not approve it?
To not approve it?
I stated an hour ago, I don't approve of this. But I don't have, you know,
So.
in the interest of expediency, normally I would have time to sign off on something, and we don't have that amount of time right now.
So it is a motion.
Okay,
I think we'd have to check, but I'm not aware that a
Okay.
veto on a motion would be appropriate.
okay. So it moves forward?
Yeah, I'm going to confirm that before the meeting's out. We still have another item and confirm whether or not the mayor has veto power on the motion.
Okay. In that case, I guess we will move on. Anything further on this topic, or we move on to agenda review? Brian?
Well, there's been a little bit of discussion, and I don't know, I thought Rob might bring this up, but around what goes into the voters pamphlet, and maybe that's another discussion for another day, with regards to council support and how that's worded and how the people that don't support it are included or not included.
Yeah, so there's two different things that need to go into the voters pamphlet. One, the county will write the ballot language because it's their proposal. And Augustus has indicated that we'll have an opportunity to review that before the end. But then also in terms of the council's support, Valerie has offered to write a letter that then I think we'll need to take a vote on and see who wants to support that and whether there's a council majority or whether individual councilors would be supporting it.
Okay, so if there is a majority, I guess we can discuss it at that point, how that would play out? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anybody has the opportunity, it costs money, of course, to put something in for the voters pamphlet. So there is a cost involved in putting a statement in for the voters pamphlet. So, yeah, that is a total, this is just the ballot measure, which would also include the explanatory statement. And Augustus said the explanatory statement, I believe, would come back to us ahead of time. That's what he said. I'm not sure.
So the language that needs to go into the voters pamphlet is going to be due by the 19th. You're going to have an opportunity to see the explanatory statement from the county. And then, yes, you'll discuss amongst you, it's a policy consideration for you to determine who's going to be signing off.
Well, on the explanatory statement, though, we don't have any, we'll see it, but then we can do a separate in the voter pamphlets, either supporting it or not supporting it. Am I correct?
If you'd like to, I mean, we will have a little bit of discretion about what goes into the explanatory statement because we're drafting a provision that's going to go into the ordinance. And so the explanatory statement has to track as much as possible with the language that's going to go in. So we're going to have a little bit of discretion as to what goes in
That's
there.
what I wasn't sure. So
and you'll see all of that before the 19th.
Rob?
Question for Augustus or JC. So if this were to pass at $1 less, you know, the levy is going to be $1 less, does that mean that tax bill November 2023, the levy will be reduced to $1, regardless of what we know is coming in or not coming in?
No, we've already filed that after the budget process, when we go through the levy and the ordinance at that point. That's when council gives their discretion of what we are levying, and that's what we file with the county. So we've already filed the $1.79 for this current fiscal year.
Yeah, but I'm saying it's next year it would, the sales tax in theory, if this passes, would start in April. Then November of 23, right, there'd be tax bills due again, and the levy would have already passed. So does that mean essentially as of November of 23, it'll come down $1 regardless? It's set in stone then, it would come down $1.
Yeah, and I'll remind you of that in that April-May time period of budget, that the levy will go from $1.79 to 79 cents.
Thank you.
Any other questions on this topic at the moment? All right. Let's look at agenda review for a minute here, and let's start off with, we had a motion from the Housing Advisory Committee, and we've been trying to figure out how to present their committee motions to you in a way that makes sense. And last couple weeks ago, you'll remember we had some in the back of a business meeting packet. And then there's kind of some confusion, I guess, still about this process and how we want to have you get the information so that we can move it into an action item. So we met last week, I guess, at the agenda meeting and thought that maybe if we give these to you at the time of agenda review at a workshop, we could make a decision about whether it's something you want to have a workshop or whether it's something you're interested in. Anyway, so what we have here is that the Housing Advisory Committee had made a motion that they're seeking the council's support for the review of impediments to housing development in the current Grants Past Development Code. The Housing Advisory Committee would like to form a subcommittee to review and amend Article 22 residential development standards with an emphasis on open space, landscaping, and parking in relation to multifamily developments. So I think they're seeking our approval to create a subcommittee. Is that the question before us here, Brad?
Twofold. That would be one. The other would be pursuing a development code amendment that reduces the amount of open space that's required if you build a multifamily development. You know, otherwise, I mean, if you don't generally support that concept, then there's no need to create a subcommittee. So that, you know, those two things kind of go hand in hand.
Okay, so just whether we want them to address that question at all. Okay, so that is their recommendation, and I guess now you know, and if you would like to, I don't think we need to have a workshop on them establishing a subcommittee, but if you want to give that nod at this time, you could, or not. Valerie?
Yeah, I would give it a nod because I think it's that we do need to try to tack away at anything that may be a roadblock in developing multifamily housing. So I'm just going to assume that as a subcommittee, and they also here shortly will have a builder on that as well, who should be able to give some input as to what they see as a barrier. So I would be in support of that.
Brian, then Rob.
Yeah, I support that as well. I believe the committee has the power to form their own subcommittees if they decide to. So I don't know that we need to even take official action other than, you know, just verbally saying we support it.
Rob?
Yeah, I agree that this is not my area of expertise, and yet there's still a few things that just stand out as being kind of counterproductive to increasing housing in Grants Pass, just from my perspective. So I'm sure that hearing more from their perspective, I would definitely help the council.
Vanessa?
I think I'd like to learn more about the topic if currently the open space requirements are outdated and perhaps are onerous on multifamily development. I think we also have to be cautious knowing that open space does provide great benefit to mental health as well, and balance the housing crisis and the need for green space.
What are you saying in terms of you'd like to know more?
I'd like to know more if the current open space codes are onerous to multifamily development and if they could be potentially
Prior
decreased.
to the committee looking into it, or you're open to them looking into that issue?
Yes, I'm open to them looking into it. Thank you.
Thank you. Rick?
I'm open to forming the subcommittee. I could think this could be a real benefit because a lot of these ordinances were written many years ago and need to be updated. Thank you.
All right. Well, that's 5 so far. So let's go ahead and, oh, you want to get in on it, Joel?
Thank you, Mayor. And I'd also like to have the subcommittee look at the quality of life And, open space is part of that, so is landscaping, and so is parking. And so it's not just about housing density, but it's about housing density in the future with a high quality of life.
All right. Agenda review. Our next meeting would be next Monday, where we're scheduled to interview a Historic Building and Sites Committee candidate, a commission candidate, and have a housing production strategy workshop with Eco Northwest. And then we would have a Wednesday business meeting that's fairly light at the moment, although some of this final review on sales tax ballot language will need to be added here, but actually, no, it will be done by Wednesday, right? Does it need to go on Monday?
So the county's second reading is on Wednesday, so I would need to realistically send it today, tomorrow at the latest.
Oh, I meant for us to, when would we be able to look at the ballot language? Would be
Like the explanatory statement and the ballot language, yeah, it could be the following Monday.
Probably really needs to be Monday instead of Wednesday next week. Monday's the 15th.
Oh, that's right. You could put it on the 19th is the deadline, so the last day you could have it on is the 17th meeting.
Okay. Well, one way or another, we'll need to get that added next week. And then next Wednesday, we have a public hearing on the ordinance considering a property line vacation along Rogue River Highway, a resolution for the Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act program on consent calendar, appointing the HBSC commission member, and that's it at this point. But Joel.
So do we need to move the discussion today with the action on the Allendale property?
So we've got a motion from council. I think it was a motion for us to move forward with a transportation impact
So you
analysis.
don't need any additional direction or council action? Okay, good.
Okay, any questions or things you'd like to get added? Brighton? Oh,
Yeah, we've been working on the homeless issue for the past year and a half, and we haven't made much of any headway till now. And some things have fallen through, and it's August, and next thing you know, winter's going to be here. So I would like to consider having a discussion about how we move forward now, in the short term and the long term with regards to the homeless. So I think that should be on a workshop soon.
Adding to that, I would love to have UCAN, because I know UCAN has gone through a lot of changes in the last year with leadership. I would love to have them come and talk to council about what money they receive, so we kind of know, and they will also, give us some information. I would imagine, I think they were helping with the emergency shelter. So I would really like to have UCAN come forward and have discussion. Just because I'd like to know. It's just like I don't know what's going on exactly with the warming shelter. I keep hearing rumors it's shutting down. So I guess I just kind of want to know what is the background of where operational monies have come from. I know we have those pallet shelters. How many pallet shelters do we have? I mean, there's just a lot of information I think that I would like to have brought forth to understand where we're at, since things are kind of in limbo right now. And since UCAN is the local organization that is taxed with doing a lot of that, I would just kind of like to have that discussion.
I think DHS takes the lead in warming and cooling centers, and then utilizes a lot of the nonprofit service providers to help provide that outreach and make that happen. Emergency management is part of that also. We had a workshop a number of months back with some of those players at the table. If you'd like a workshop, we could try to coordinate that. If you'd like a memo on what some of your questions might be, if I can get those questions in advance, we can get some of that information to you in a memo or a workshop.
Is your hand for this topic, Rob? Go ahead.
I guess, Valerie mentioned the pallet shelters, and I guess I'd like maybe UCAN or a UCAN perspective. Do they have any ideas as to what we can do with those this year that's more beneficial than just having them sit in the city yard? Mm-hmm. So if they know that we have them, if they have a perspective on that, I'd like to hear that too.
All right, Vanessa, was your hand about something different?
It was, but I do support moving forward on that as well. It was a separate topic, if anyone else has anything to add to this.
Okay, sounds like we have some interest in having a workshop related to that topic. What's your topic?
I wanted to bring up the topic again of swift water rescue. I know in mid-July, I brought this up under agenda review, and it was the direction to move the conversation to the Board of County Commissioners. Since then, they've canceled 2 meetings with the city and, 1 meeting, and I don't see any productivity coming from that referral to the county. So since then, we've had numerous water rescues within the city limits, and our fire department is responding, and they are not adequately prepared to be responding to these calls for service. We now have a Marine deputy, and in the memo from Randy, it does state that a multi-agency approach is the best approach to these types of rescues. So I wanted to revitalize this topic and ask if the council has reconsidered bringing this discussion forward.
I guess I just assumed, since that they had hired a Marine deputy, and what I read in the newspaper was that he was going up and down between Griffin Creek and here, that he was the person who was now tasked with that. I don't know if there's something else we need to know about that. I mean, I don't know, because I don't understand how it all works, but I do know that they did hire a Marine deputy, and just from reading the newspaper, like I said, it was in his parameter to go up and down the city. So,
Rob?
So, yeah, Valerie, I totally, it would be easy to make the assumption that that kind of covered it, but I have to wonder, that person I'm sure has a specific shifts, maximum hours of shifts per day, and I would imagine that there could easily be rescues at, 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock or midnight or whatever, and I wouldn't want to see one of our firemen get injured or worse due to lack of having appropriate equipment or training to go in and try to make a rescue where maybe it may not have been the best decision to make that attempt. So I'd rather see us have some really trained people with equipment, appropriate equipment, to be able to respond at, midnight or whenever an emergency could come up. So I get it, during the day it seemed like the Marine deputy is the thing and has that covered, but I have to wonder if that really covers all the hours that we could have an emergency.
Augustus?
So Mayor, in regard to your question about not approving the motion on the language to go into the county ordinance, the charter does specifically limit that non-approval to ordinances and resolutions. So if you wanted to, you could within 3 days submit an objection to non-approval of the resolution granting consent, which is what we're relying on to draft that language, and then it would have to be set for the next meeting for deliberation by council. The obvious problem with that is that language is due to the county by Wednesday, so essentially this entire effort would be scuttled if that's the route you wanted to take.
So that would be the resolution that was passed last Wednesday?
That's correct.
That I haven't signed yet today? Okay, thanks for the information. Think about that for a minute. Okay, sounds like we do have some interest in pursuing more background on swift water rescue. Anything else for agenda?
yeah, well, especially since we have discussions with the council, doesn't help
Okay.
the conversation. That's what it comes down to.
All right, well, regarding, I guess, I've said all along, you know, I don't think the sales tax is the way to go. I don't mind the voters telling you all that. Brian?
Yeah, I just had a question because I thought this whole thing we were talking about today was the ordinance.
It's the county's ordinance.
Well,
Yeah.
we're talking about it, but
It's complicated. It's language for the county's ordinance because the county is really the one enacting the sales tax. So we have to provide kind of a clause of what our intent is regarding our portion to them.
okay, so the
And
city,
and to do that, last week, the council voted on a consent resolution. And that consent resolution gives the city the opportunity to draft its own language to go into the county ordinance. Because without that consent, you'd essentially have the county dictating to a home rule city how it would deal with its levy, and that's outside of the county's purview. But with the consent resolution, that's what would allow our language to be in the county ordinance.
okay, so the language that we're drafting, what is that? Is that an ordinance, or is that, what form does that language
So the
exist
language
in?
that you considered today is going to be going into a county ordinance. However, what I was referring to is Chapter 5 of the Charter. It gives the enumerated powers of the mayor under Section 1, subsection 2. And that states, if the mayor does not approve of an ordinance or resolution so submitted, the mayor must, within 3 days from the receipt thereof, return the same to the city recorder. So she has to return the resolution to the city recorder with the mayor's written reasons for not approving it. And if the mayor does not return it within 3 days, such ordinance or resolution shall become law as if the mayor had approved it. Within 3 days of the return of a disapproved ordinance or resolution, the city recorder must notify the council of such action. And then the next subsection states that at the next hearing after the non-approval has been submitted, it's going to be up for discussion with council, and then council needs 3/4 of the vote to override the mayor's disapproval. So you're talking about the resolution from last week, and if that gets taken out, even if the mayor were to decide today that she doesn't approve of the resolution itself, then we're not putting any language into the county ordinance. The county sales tax is going to proceed without our input into how we're going to reduce the levy, because by next week, by the time we have our meeting next week, that time period will have passed.
Okay, so our discussion today about the language, that's just going to go to the county in the form of like a memo or something?
Yes, so I would get in touch with county legal and let them know this is our language to put it into their ordinance. They'll probably have it on legal counsel update for tomorrow, and then they'll advance it to the weekly business session for second reading.
Okay, thanks.
Well, I've never agreed with moving forward on the sales tax. It's funny to me that it's called LARAT because I think I smell LARAT. It's got so many things wrong with it that I know that the voters will not support it in the end. The last one failed by 78%. So this whole thing to me has been an exercise in, allowing you guys the flexibility of making a bad decision here. Kind of disgusted by the decision to move forward on option 1 today, because I think that the council's intent has always been to reduce the levy by the amount generated by the sales tax if the sales tax were to pass. And that was described in option 2 today. So option 1 may be in some way more simple for people to understand, but it wasn't the right decision. That said, I know that you're in a time crunch, And this is a complicated process, and I do not want to sign off on putting this forward whatsoever, but I know that the voters aren't going to support it, and I wish that I could do more right now to help come up with a better solution for the sheriff, because I do support Dave Daniel and the sheriff's office as well as our public safety, and I think that this is a really important issue. And I said back like in the spring that we're barking up the wrong tree, and here we are, 5-6 months later, and they're facing a fiscal cliff at the county, and we're running out of time to fix this problem. But I'm not going to veto what you passed last Wednesday, because I think there's no harm in letting the voters decide this question, but the real harm that you've done is not finding a better solution and putting this forward. So I will sign off on it, but I totally disagree. And with that, I will, Rick.
So Augustus, after the fact, what opportunities does the council have if something goes forward and is not stated in the ordinance by the county? Are we independent enough to publish something that's, I would say unofficial, but is separate?
Talking about in a circumstance where council might want to pursue different policy than the ordinance?
Yes.
So the city council retains its discretion over all issues regarding its levy. Really, the point of putting this in the ordinance, the language in the ordinance, was to broadcast to the voters that the levy was going to be reduced. And so council still retains that discretion with how it deals with its levy as a public policy point.
Okay,
Does that
I
answer your
appreciate
question?
that. Thank you.
Any other questions? Brian,
I move that we adjourn.
is there a second? Second from Vanessa. All in favor of adjourning today?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, see you next Monday.
Another day, another dollar.